To start off, I was hoping just to take a quick poll from everybody to see where you're at with studying for the LSAT. So if you just want to drop in the chat, if you're just thinking about the LSAT, if you're actively studying, or if you're signed up for a test date, that would be awesome if that is working. Let's see, I'll give everyone a sec. Haven't started. No need to have a frown face. Okay. Awesome. Okay. So it looks like most people are just thinking about the LSAT, which is great because that's mostly what my presentation is geared towards. So we'll go ahead and get started. So a little bit about me. Like I said, I graduated from Wellesley in 2020. After graduating, I worked as a litigation paralegal at Kirkland & Ellis for about 3 years. And after taking the LSAT, I started tutoring and I moved to Breckenridge, Colorado. I got into law school last year. I deferred my admission for a year and I've kind of been tutoring since then. I'm going to start at NYU this fall. And yeah, I love tutoring. I liked my job as a paralegal, but I love working with students. And it's been awesome. I got a 179 on the LSAT. So that's some of my credentials. While I was at Wellesley, I was involved in the Pre-Law Society, I was involved in SPOG, and I was involved in TISI. So if you're in any of those, I love those organizations. So now let's go to our agenda. So today we're going to go over really basic stuff about the LSAT, and then we'll talk about different phases of studying and some solid study strategies and study plans that I recommend. Within that, I'll tell you my recommended resources to use for studying, and then we'll have a question and answer session at the end. I'm happy to talk about my experience, any specific questions about the LSAT, or specific section strategy. So if you could just keep all your questions to the end in case I answer them throughout the presentation, that would be great. Feel free to drop a question in the chat and I can come back to it later. All right, let's get started. So super basic, what is the LSAT? It stands for the Law School Admissions Test. And then you'll hear me saying LSAC or LSAC a lot, and that's the Law School Admissions Council. So LSAC are the people who administers the LSAT and facilitates law school applications. A first question a lot of people ask is, why is the LSAT important? I'm sure you've heard a lot of maybe myths or just general chatter about why the LSAT is so important. It's one of the most important factors in your law school applications. Obviously, they consider your GPA, your extracurriculars, other things that you've done, your essays, stuff like that, but it is a pretty big part of your applications. When should I take it? The LSAT is administered about every other month. It's different every year. So for example, this year there's a January test, a February test, an April test, a June test, and then an August test. So it's good to plan out what tests you're thinking about because it's given at specific times throughout the year, and every law school application cycle, there's a deadline for the last test you could take. It's a good idea to plan out your studying to be able to achieve the score you want. Most people study for some time between 4 and 6 months. Mine looked more like 9 months just because I was working full time. But make sure that you're giving yourself enough time to study. I also like to say, remember that the rest of your law school applications outside of the LSAT also take a lot of time. So keep that in mind while you're planning out your test date. It might be difficult to study and do the rest of your applications at the same time. So starting your studying earlier than you might think is generally good practice. Also, a personal anecdote, I would like to say, don't be afraid of taking a gap year in terms of when you should take the LSAT. I was too involved at Wellesley to manage studying for the LSAT between my work, extracurriculars, schoolwork, and you have to have fun too. It just didn't work for me. So I took it after graduating, and that's totally fine. I know when you're at Wellesley, it feels like everyone's so on top of things, but remember, everyone has a different path. So figure out what's best for you. And if you have more questions about taking time off before law school, I'm happy to talk about my experience during the Q&A session. Lastly, what's a good LSAT score? Everyone wants to know this. A good LSAT score is the best that you can do personally. I think I do recommend looking at the median LSAT scores for the schools you'd like to apply to. to have a general idea of the kind of scores they accept. But remember, if their median's around a 170, a good portion of their applicants who were admitted got under a 170. So just keep that in mind. So what does the LSAT actually look like? The LSAT's made up of 3 scored sections, 1 experimental section, and 1 written section. So the experimental and the written section are both unscored. Each section is 35 minutes. It's not a content-based test. And while it's not a content-based test that you memorize things for, you do have to learn a new way of thinking and analyzing arguments. So there is some content to learn. It generally tests your ability to think analytically, think critically, and comprehend dense passages of text. So what are the sections that it's made up of? Currently, if you take the test in February, in April, or in June, the test you'll see 3 scored sections. One's logical reasoning, one's reading comprehension, and one's logic games, which I'll get into later. But the LSAT is soon changing the format of the test. So in August 2024, you'll still have 3 scored sections and 1 experimental, but it will be made up of 2 logical reasoning sections and 1 reading comprehension section, and then 1 writing section. They're getting rid of logic games. A lot of people ask why. It's because logic games aren't accessible to all people. So I think it's actually a good thing. And it's nice you don't have to learn an entire new section. It can also save time in your studying because you only have to learn 2 sections instead of 3. So I'm not going to be talking about logic games in this presentation because it's not super relevant to most people. But if you have more specific questions about logic games, if you're taking the April or June exam, I'm happy to chat. So now we'll go through each section. So logical reasoning tests your ability to draw deductions from a set of facts and your ability to understand and evaluate arguments. Each question consists of a brief paragraph, which is usually an argument, so a couple of sentences, and then a question about the contents of that paragraph with 5 multiple choice answer choices. On each logical reasoning section, you'll get 25 or 26 questions on each section. So with 35 minutes, that means you have about 1 minute and 20 seconds per question, which is pretty fast. This section is all about quickly digesting the information, reasoning logically, obviously, because it's logical reasoning, and being really precise with the language and the stimulus and the answer choices. The next section is reading comprehension. So this section has 4 longer passages followed by 4 to 8 questions on each passage. And there will be somewhere between 26 and 28 questions distributed amongst those 4 passages. One thing to keep in mind is that reading for the LSAT is not like reading in the rest of your life. So there's still strategies to learn, even though it's obviously testing your reading comprehension. The passages can be on any subject from dinosaurs to law to specific film types from the 1920s and art. Often people avoid studying for reading comprehension because it's a little bit more boring than doing a ton of the LR questions in a row, but remember just to dedicate enough time to it because this is often the section that people will see sink their scores in the end. Finally, the writing section. This is 35 minutes as well. It's not scored. So you'll basically write an essay using exam software provided by LSAT, and it's a short, persuasive essay. It doesn't count towards your LSAT score, but you are required to complete it to receive your score. The good news is you only have to do this 1 time. So if you happen to retake the LSAT, you wouldn't have to retake this again. There's mixed information about how law schools use this section. So it's not something to sleep over and to stress about a ton, but definitely don't put it off. I always recommend doing a couple practices before your test day. At the very least, they're looking to see if you can make an argument. So what the prompt looks like is they'll give you, this is a sample prompt, but they will give you a prompt showing 2 sides of a dilemma with pros and cons for each side. And you need to kind of pick one side and run with it. Talk about, why your pros are better than the other pros, why the cons aren't that bad. I really like this website. It's a Power Score blog, and if you scan the QR code, it'll bring you there. It's a really great overview of how to approach the writing section. Yeah, let's see. Finally, you'll see one experimental section. This is a section where they're testing questions for future administrations of the exam. Because they want it to be the same as if you were taking any other section, they're going to hide it in the test. So you won't know during the test which section is experimental. Coming up in August, it's either going to be a logical reasoning or a reading comprehension section. So on testing, you won't know which one's experimental, so you should treat every section as if it's a scored section. But that being said, if you bomb a section early on, I'm a full believer in convincing yourself that it was the experimental section, because it may very well have been. And this way you don't let, how you think you performed on one section bleed into the rest of the sections. But yeah, unfortunately, you won't know even after the test what the experimental section was. So now that we've gone over the 4 different sections of the test, we'll kind of get into what a solid study strategy looks like. So a good study plan, in my opinion, comes in 2 phases. First, you want to master the fundamentals. I'll go through each one of these individually, and you want to master the fundamentals before you get into a practice testing phase. Mastering the fundamentals is admittedly the worst part of studying for the LSAT. It's definitely a slog. It feels boring to go through, but it's a necessary evil. And you want to make sure you spend enough time mastering the fundamentals before moving on to practice testing. So here are some goals and things that you'll learn while mastering the fundamentals. I find that a lot of students want to see their progress and end up taking practice tests way too early. The reason this is not helpful is you're not making the most out of your time. If you haven't learned enough, there's not really going to be a change in your score, and you're also wasting your material. There's only a limited amount of released LSAT practice tests. There's about 75 tests that are currently released. It seems like a lot, but when you combine drilling practice questions and taking full practice tests, it's a lot less than you might think. That's like the biggest mistake I see students making. For example, I'm currently working with a student who has taken every single question like that has ever been released, and there's just not much you can do from there because you can't get an accurate score. So if you take anything away from this, spend enough time mastering the fundamentals and reviewing your practice tests. There's a lot to learn up front, and it's mainly training your brain how to think in LSAT land, like I call it. But then there's also concrete things you need to learn, like conditional logic, approaches to each question type, about assumptions and logical force. So yeah, lots to learn. I often find that students I work with get confused about how to focus their notes when they're going through the curriculum. So here's a note-taking template that I came up with. If you scan the QR code, it will pull up this Google Doc for you. I find that this really helps students narrow down what to focus on when they're like reading their textbook or going through different curriculums. Also, at the very end of the slide, I have another link that combines all of these QR codes you'll see, so don't stress if you can't find it. But yeah, I highly recommend using this note-taking strategy. It really emphasizes all the information you want to focus on while going through the fundamentals. So this might seem all very vague, and what am I going to be learning? This is an example of the kind of thing that you're going to be learning. So logical reasoning has a lot of different question types that are going to ask you to perform different operations on each question. This is just, there's a couple more question types, but these are the main question types. So the way that you approach a weakened question and you're trying to weaken the argument is going to be different than you approach a flaw question. So that's kind of the content that you'll be learning. These are some of the resources that I recommend for this mastering the fundamentals phase. So there's a couple different ways you can go about studying. One is video-based. So a video-based curriculum can look like a self-study. It can look like self-studying where you have videos for each lesson. I really like Blueprint and PowerScore. They're really awesome, and I find their strategies really set up a solid foundation. The most cost-effective video-based course is 7Sage. So Blueprint and PowerScore are both about $200 a month, and 7Sage is $70 a month. So 7 Stage is the most cost-effective one that I would recommend. There's also options if you want a live online course, or even some offer live in-person courses through Blueprint and PowerScore. So if you're a visual learner, if you learn better by doing interactive videos and things like that, I would recommend the video-based. There are free resources like Khan Academy, but I really wouldn't recommend investing in books before using Khan Academy. I've just found that a lot of students who come to me for tutoring, we have to end up unlearning some of those strategies. So I would stick to books before Khan Academy, but if it's really your only option, that could be okay. You could even try getting one of these LSAT prep books through the library through ILL. And yeah, the books that I recommend, I really like the Manhattan Prep books and PowerScore. And then the Loophole Method is an awesome book. It's only for logical reasoning. The author, she teaches logical reasoning in a different way than any of the mainstream test prep companies. I don't really recommend that people start with the Loophole Method because I don't want to say it's funky, but it's definitely different. I usually use the Loophole Method to supplant, like to add to your knowledge rather than be like the base of your knowledge. But you can't go wrong with any of these materials. I would also just things to avoid. I would avoid any materials that don't use official LSAT questions. I've just found they're not super useful. It's really hard to replicate exactly what LSAT is testing. So yeah, let's see. At the end of studying for your fundamentals, you do want to start working in some timed practice. So while you're learning the fundamentals, any resource you use is going to have drills and practice questions to, practice like the strategies that you've been learning. You should initially be doing all of these drills and practice questions untimed because it's really important to increase your accuracy before working on timing. It's no use being able to do the questions fast if you're getting them wrong. But eventually timing does become a problem. So near the end of your curriculum, you should slowly start mixing in timed practice. I usually recommend doing the practice questions the resources will provide you. Just time yourself on how long it takes you. Do about 5 questions and take the average time between how long it takes you. And then start trying to go a little bit faster and a little bit faster. I recommend doing this once you're about 3/4 the way through your curriculum. But for example, if it takes you 3 minutes at first on average to do a question, try and do practice questions in 2 minutes and 45 seconds and then 2 minutes and 30 seconds until you get down to your goal time. You can also start, again, once you're about 3/4 of the way through your curriculum, you can start mixing in loosely timed practice sections for mixed review. So for example, I recommend trying a section at 40 or 45 minutes instead of 35 minutes, so that you can slowly work your time down while keeping your accuracy high. These practice sections should be from earlier tests so that you don't waste your material, like I was talking about earlier. You'll hear me say that a lot. It's, in my opinion, the biggest mistake you can make with studying for the LSAT. So that's pretty much it for mastering the fundamentals. And now we can move on to your practice testing phase. So once you've gone through all your curriculum, you've been incorporating practice sections, you want to move to practice testing. So this is my personal method that I've come up with after studying myself for the LSAT, and I kind of refined it while tutoring students. It takes some stuff from other test prep companies, but I've seen a lot of success with it with my students. I totally recommend it. And I'll go to each one of these steps individually, but the purpose of this method is to first use your time and your material wisely. So you're not wasting your practice tests, you're spending plenty of time reviewing it. Also, it's in your best interest because then you won't have to take as much time studying for the LSAT. The second thing it does is it ensures that you substantively change your strategy in between each practice test to avoid score plateaus. So what I see a lot of people doing is they're like, I'm taking practice tests, I'm not getting any better. Well, if you keep taking practice tests over and over without reviewing and changing your strategy and adjusting how you're approaching the test, it's kind of like running a half marathon every week. Eventually, will you get faster at that half marathon? Yes, you will get faster a little bit. but there's no way you would increase your speed in running the marathon as much as if you drilled and trained in between. So it's really important to make sure you're getting the most out of your practice test. And then the third thing it does is it gets you used to taking a practice test. So when you see the actual LSAT exam, it doesn't feel like a new novel thing you're taking on. It feels just like any other practice test. So by the time you get to actual test day, I want you to be like, oh, I've done this so many times. It's just another practice test. Typically, this pattern takes place over the span of a week or 2 weeks. I don't typically recommend taking a practice test more than once a week because you will not have time to review it and change your strategy from one test to a next. So first off, what does the actual taking the practice test look like? So first of all, take your practice test in full test-like conditions. This is so that your test score is accurate. If you take it with loose timing or not all in one sitting, you're not going to have an accurate measure of actually where you are in your studying. I also recommend trying out different times of taking your practice test. So maybe one day take it at 8 a.m., maybe one day take it at noon. If you're taking the test remotely, you sign up for the test right away. You have a pretty full options of what time to take the test. So I want you to figure out what time works best for your brain. My second tip is to start with lower numbered / older practice tests and you work your way up to the newer tests. So like I was saying, LSAC has released all these tests, right? The ones they have on their website start at about 30 and they go all the way up to test 94. So the lower numbers are the older tests and the newer numbers are the newer tests. The tests all have really good information, but the older tests are just less relevant than the new tests because they do change a little bit over time. And so you want to wait until you're closer to your actual test to take those newer practice tests so that you can be as fresh as possible for your actual LSAT test. It's better to work out the kinks of your strategy when you're scoring lower on older tests than on the newer tests. So save the newest ones for last. I usually recommend when you're taking full practice tests, start in the 60s, the practice test numbered in the 60s and work your way up to the 90s. If you schedule yourself out and you're going to take less practice tests than that, maybe start in the 70s and work your way up to the 90s. And then the third thing is while you're taking your practice test, flag any questions that you're not sure of while taking the test. This is for the next step, blind review. You will most likely feel like you're flagging a lot of questions at first, but as you get more and more questions right and more confident about the test, you'll be flagging less and less. So if you've been wondering, what are these prep test numbers that Kenny's talking about? Where do I take these practice tests? This slide's for you. So Law Prep Plus is an official resource from LSAC that has every official release practice test. This is also the same place you'll go to take your actual LSAT if you're taking it remotely. It has the same exact interface you'll see on the test day. So it's a really good tool to get used to taking the practice test. It does unfortunately cost $115 a year, but there's a couple things. If you have the LSAC fee waiver, it's free under certain tiers, and we'll talk about that at the end. And it's a great resource for drilling because you can drill older tests, you can drill different sections. Again, you get all the official release tests. It's also a required purchase for any online LSAT prep subscription. So let's say you decide to do 7Sage for your drilling and your curriculum. To even use 7Sage, you'll have to purchase this, which is unfortunate, but it is what it is. But I totally recommend buying this for your studying. And it's a great resource. Okay, after you've taken your practice test. So usually when I was studying, for example, I would take my practice test on Sunday and then I would blind review or take my practice test on Saturday and then blind review on Sunday. Typically, you want to blind review the day after you take your practice test. Blind review, maybe you heard of it, maybe you didn't. A lot of test prep companies implement this method, and it's awesome because it gives you a ton of really good data for what's going on in your LSAT. So these are the steps of blind review. It's a lot of text on here. But first of all, after you want to take your time test in the practice test space and flag any questions you aren't 100% sure you got correct. Then you don't want to look at the questions you got right or wrong after the test. Just mark down the questions you flagged on a piece of paper or in a spreadsheet. So that's where the blind part comes in. So you don't know what answer choice you chose and you don't know what the actual right or wrong question is. And then ideally the next day, so that you had a time to step away from the test, you don't really want to do it the same day as you take the LSAT because you'll just get a little bit overloaded. So ideally a day or two after you've taken the LSAT, you want to open a new blank untimed test and retake only the questions you flagged. So you don't have to take the entire test all over again. It's just the questions you flagged that you were kind of shaky on, and you're taking an untimed setting. So this is going to give a ton of really good information for what's going wrong. So when you're taking the test, you just felt too rushed and then you couldn't get to this question. Great. Now you get to see the question again in an untimed setting. But for example, let's say you get the question wrong on the test and right on blind review, then I want you to reflect on your thinking and think about what changed between the actual test and the blind review test that got you to the right answer the second time. So after you take all of those flagged questions in an untimed setting, you want to go through each question you retook, or the questions you didn't flag and got wrong, and fill out a blind review tracker or wrong answer journal, which I'll show on the next slide. But again, this is to fill out that information of, what went right, what went wrong. If you got it wrong on both the practice test and on blind review, maybe there's a fundamental gap in your knowledge. So what that kind of blind review spreadsheet or wrong answer journal could look like is above. So the things that are highlighted in yellow are the most important information. This stuff is just so you can track what question it is if you need to go back to it. Question type's really important to help you figure out what your most missed question types are. And then the most important part is the substantive notes on explanation and what went right or wrong. So filling out a spreadsheet like this is helpful to aggregate your data and make sure you're doing something with all of the time you just spent taking the test and blind reviewing it. I see with so many of my students that they review their test, especially if they don't do blind review. They go through all the questions that they got wrong, they're reviewing it, and it's kind of in one ear, out the other. It's really easy to see a question, and when you can see what the right answer is, you're like, oh, I totally see that. I know why I got it wrong. But you really need to find a way to keep all those notes in one place so you can come back to them so you don't keep making the same mistakes over and over. But yeah, I have a QR code here and it's also at the end. To create your own spreadsheet. It really helps you make the best use of your time to focus on the problem areas that you need to focus on and find out what's going wrong. The more of the spreadsheet you fill out, as you keep filling it out, also there will be patterns emerging in what's going wrong. This second part here is I also like to track your actual practice tests. So this is just an example. So this is really important. So, if you want to reach those high score brackets, it's really important to even notice the small things. So let's say you did worse on tests than you've normally been doing on it. I want you to reflect on what was different about this test and other tests. Did you only sleep 3 hours the night before? Or, did you not drink your coffee? Did you drink too much coffee? That will kind of help you track, what time's best for you to take the test, what went wrong on that test, and you can again find patterns in what the ideal test taking situation is for yourself. Just for an example, this is my personal blind review tracker that I use for my own studying. You're welcome to scan the QR code and see all of my data. Just to reiterate, filling out a spreadsheet like this is important because it helps you first aggregate your data so you're studying what you actually need to improve and studying efficiently. Second, it forces you to reflect on the questions you're unsure of and on your thought process, which helps avoid the main mistake I see of wasting material. And third, it helps reveal patterns in your test taking. So this could be, what questions are you always getting wrong? It could be maybe you're focusing on the wrong part of the question, not paying enough attention to strength of language. Maybe you always get tripped up by the trick answer choice. I know it seems really tedious to do all of these steps after each practice test, but I promise it's really worth it and it's how you're going to improve. Okay, after blind review, then for the first part of that week, so like I said, let's just say I'm on a week-long pattern. So I practice test, blind review, I practice test on Saturday, blind review Sunday. Then for the first part of the week, I'm gonna go back to the basics. So what this looks like is you want to identify your top 3 to 5 most missed question types or RC passage test types from your last test, which is really easy to do with your wrong answer journal or blind review spreadsheet, and then go back to your curriculum or to new curriculum to try and refresh your strategy and add new tips and tricks for these question types. So let's say you use 7-stage for your curriculum, and you miss a lot of must be true questions. What I'd want you to do is go back to 7-stage, rewatch the video or go back to your book, reread the chapter, see if there's any strategies that you haven't been using that you could try and implement. If you have a friend who's studying for the LSAT, ask them for their book, see what that different test prep company says about that question type, and take what you like and leave what you don't. So what you're trying to do is pick up new tips and tricks to help you get to the right answer and to change your approach to that question type to get more questions correct on the next one. You can also look online. For example, the Power Score blog is really great. I really like LSAT hacks. And as you're going back to the basics and reviewing different curriculum, I want you to make sure you're writing down your new strategy in your notes somewhere. This is also what can be really helpful with working with a tutor. They can help point out, different strategies you can try, what's going wrong in your thought process, and help inform what this study looks like for the rest of the week. But it's definitely possible to do yourself. All right. After you go back to the basics, then you have to drill to reinforce your new strategy. So that's a lot of the reason you want to make sure you write down your new strategy, the new tips and tricks you've picked up. So I want you to drill your top missed question types to make sure that you are practicing that new method and way of thinking and approaching the question types so that when you get back into your timed practice test, you don't go back to your old ways. While you're drilling to reinforce, keep referring back to your blind review spreadsheet and your notes of your new strategies to make sure you're not making the same mistakes over and over. If you're trying to fix a general strategy, like for example, speeding up on the beginning questions and slowing down at the end, drilling could also look like working in full practice sections during your week, or full RC passages, especially for reading comprehension. A lot of times the strategy comes to how are you going to take notes on the passage and things like that. So the drilling wouldn't look like individual questions, it would be bigger question sets. Then you got to repeat the pattern. So again, it's practice test, blind review, back to the basics, drill to reinforce. I find this is super helpful for making sure you're substantively changing your strategy in between each practice test. You're not wasting material and you're focusing on what you need the most help on. I recommend at the very least taking about 10 practice tests, depending on how you're scoring and using this method. But some people, I think I took about 20. Some people take even 30 practice tests. It definitely depends on each person, but you do want a significant amount of tests before you take your actual LSAT exam. All right, finally, some do's and don'ts of the LSAT. So first of all, definitely, if you're like, wow, this all sounds really expensive. Yes, it's expensive. There are cost-effective ways to do it, but I highly encourage, if you even think you might qualify for a fee waiver, to look at LSAC's fee waiver program and see if you qualify for one, and you can always apply. This can give you help with costs of studying for the LSAT. It can help they'll sometimes give you free applications to law school and things like that. Another way to save money is to sign up for the Credit Assembly Service Candidate Referral Service. So this comes more when you're actually getting ready to apply to law school. But based on your GPA and your LSAT score, if you sign up for this service, they will send out they will send schools your statistics basically, and the schools can opt to give you free fee waivers. So I think I saved like $1,000 from fee waivers when applying to law school just by signing up for this. The only con is that you will get a ton of emails from random law schools, but up to you if that's worth the money or not. Another thing to make sure to do is give yourself enough time to study. I see a lot of students really trying to rush it and cram it, and the LSAT's just not something that you can cram. Another thing to make sure to do is spend more time reviewing than you do taking the actual practice test. I think I've talked about that a lot, about not to waste your material. Lastly, apply for accommodations if you qualify. The LSAT was written for a very specific brain, written for men by men. I think men statistically do better on it. So if you qualify for accommodations, I totally encourage you to apply. Things to not do. I hope if you take one thing away from this, don't waste your practice test. The biggest mistake I see students make. Don't study without a strategy. If you kind of follow the general strategy I outlined, you should be pretty set, but just kind of having a more structured idea in mind of how to go about it is going to be helpful. Also, don't rush through the fundamentals. I meet with a lot of students who are in the practice testing phase, and what we actually have to do is go back through and kind of unlearn some weird strategies that they picked up because they really rush the fundamentals. So you want to feel really solid about approaching it before you get into the practice testing phase. Finally, and also if you rush through the fundamentals, you will probably have to go back to relearn it in order to get into that top score band that I know most Wellesley students are going for. So you're not really saving yourself time, you're gonna end up adding that time on in the end. Finally, don't let your score get you down. Your LSAT doesn't tell me anything about you. It doesn't tell me how you're gonna do in law school. It doesn't tell me how you're gonna be as a lawyer. My diagnostic was like in the 140s or something. In my opinion, again, this is my opinion, not Wellesley College pre-law services, but I think it's just a test that you have to game in order to get into the law schools you want and to get scholarships. So remember that the LSAT's a learnable test, and if you're not scoring where you are, just keep pushing at it, try and refine your approach, and I think you'll get there. All right, I've talked enough at everybody. Oh, wonderful. Nicole also pointed out that there's a career ed mini grant that would cover the cost of the Law Hub Advantage. So definitely do that. What questions can I answer for all of you? Also, this is the QR code for all the resources that I linked. If it's not working, let me know. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. My website's below. I do a free 30-minute consultation for everybody. So if you just want to talk about like your own LSAT and you're not even interested in tutoring, totally happy to help out. So what other questions can I answer?
Kennedy, thank you so much. I just want to note that I'm going to turn off the recording so that people can feel a little bit more free to ask whatever questions are on their mind.
Cool, sounds good.